When I saw that video of Mr. George Floyd, something happened. I knew I'd never be the same. I had to write, and this is what I wrote. In our country in 1865, the U.S. Constitution's 13th Amendment ended black slavery. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship and the protection of the law from, among other things, lynchings. The 14th Amendment stated that no person would be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 152 years later, on May 25th, 2020, 4 officers of the law who were sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution became the judge, the jury, the executioner of Mr. George Floyd. Even though arrested, what happened to Mr. George Floyd's 11th Amendment legal right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty? Those of us who watched the video saw the horror of what appeared to be another modern-day lynching. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we see one of the police officers with his hand in his pocket, a heartless expression on his face, and a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, while Mr. Floyd pleads for his life at least 16 times in 5 minutes, saying, "I can't breathe." The officers ignore his pleas. The bystanders who are videoing the incident tell the officers he can't breathe, but they're unheard. When the ambulance arrives, the officer's knee is on Mr. Floyd's neck a minute longer until the EMT tells him to move it. The ambulance takes Mr. Floyd away and is later pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. The Floyd's legal team says an independent autopsy determined that his death was a homicide caused by suffocation. Mr. Floyd's constitutional and humanitarian rights were desecrated. Mr. Floyd was a man, a brother, a fiancé, a father. This is very personal. I have a multicultural lineage that shares African American heritage of Mr. Floyd, and so does my wife, Trudy, and our 3 sons, Tim, Jeremy, and Jordy, and our daughter, Sydney. Today, we are standing up for black lives. From 1619 to 2020, 400 years of Mr. Floyd's experience has been repeated for millions of black men, women, and children who have faced similar and other forms of injustice everywhere in our country. There are inequalities and injustices in our health care, education, employment, wealth, police, legal, and prison systems. And African Americans still live in terror of the threat of losing our lives in our own home, like Breonna Taylor, sitting in a car like Philando Castile, out for a jog like Ahmaud Arbery, or just breathing like Eric Gardner and George Floyd just because they were black. Mr. Floyd's death was a tipping point for igniting our racial injustice anger. Mr. Floyd's death has brought attention to this ugly and painful 400-year open wound of a traumatic racialized experiences that constantly threaten the lives of African Americans. A wound that America has never fully owned, confronted, or paid restitution for. And today, the expression of this infected wound has once again spilled over into the streets as the blood of Mr. George Floyd and millions of others cry out to be heard. Will you stand up for black lives? Can you see Mr. George Floyd? You can't see Mr. Floyd if you look at his blackness through the eyes of colorblindness or unconscious bias. To truly see him, you must see Mr. Floyd's blackness in the context of his ancestors, his history, and his experiences. Only then will you see him understand and appreciate who he was. He was a beautiful, strong black man and your brother, stamped in the very image of God. Mr. Floyd was who he was because his ancestors were stolen from their country and endured the evil of 246 years of inhumane treatment as slaves, property to be bought, sold, worked, starved, beaten, raped, and murdered without legal consequences. Mr. Floyd was who he was because his ancestors were oppressed for 100 years under legalized discrimination. Mr. Floyd was who he was because of his 46 years of living under the disadvantage of a systemic, racialized society that fought against him every step of the way, with a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on mass incarceration, a war against black lives. It's time to open our eyes and see that Mr. Floyd and all these black lives more than matter. Will you stand up for black lives? Can you hear Mr. George Floyd? Maybe you can't hear Mr. George Floyd and other African Americans who are calling out, I can't breathe. But why? It may be because hearing their voices makes you uncomfortable and defensive about the legacy of your ancestors' transgressions or your own. Maybe your advantage and privilege has shielded you from ever having to face it. Maybe it's hard for you to hear that your ancestors who covered their eyes to the cries of black injustices made them just as guilty as those who did the evil. Maybe it's hard for you to hear African Americans have been traumatized by systems that have forever scarred their lives. It's hard for you to hear, and that's the problem. It's not about you. It's about hearing Mr. George Floyd's cry and the cry of other black brothers and sisters who are saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And finally, it's your turn. You must choose. Will you see Mr. Floyd and his people? Will you hear him and his people? And what will you do about it? Will you stand up for black lives? Will you stand up for black lives and act justly by seeing the worth and value of black lives and treating us that way? Will you stand up for black lives and love mercy by paying the price to identify with us and doing what it takes to help? Will you stand up for black lives and walk humbly by not being a savior, but listen and walk in our pain and God's healing? Will you stand up for black lives? I will stand up for black lives.